Um, Hello, thank you for joining us. I hope everyone can see me and can see the screen. If you can't, please, if you can just drop a comment in the chat. Thank you for joining. My name is Abdulrasheed Isa, and I'm a lecturer with the Economics Department here at Nile University of Nigeria. And it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this lecture by Dr. Danielle Guizzo from the University of Bristol. This session is part of the Pluralist Economics Workshop, which is an all-day workshop from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. today. And this is the second in the series of the lectures. And we're glad to have Dr. Danielle, who will speak on toward economic pluralism perspectives from the history of economic thought. Dr. Danielle will talk for about 45 minutes, and then we can often we can open the floor for conversation. Yeah, so before she starts, I'd like to make a brief introduction for Dr. Danielle. She's a senior lecturer at the University of Bristol. She recently moved from University of the West of England in Bristol again, so it's just a transition, but not a transition, I should say. Last year, she co-authored a book on what is heterodox economics, I think, conversation with leading economists. If you want, I think you can find that book. She studied PhD economics. Let me just read from her schools. So she has expertise in history of economic thought, philosophy of economics, and economics education. She's also on the steering committee of Diversifying and Decolonizing Economics, which she co-founded with some other fantastic heterodox economists in the UK, US, and India, I think. So she's very active in rethinking economics, and I'm sure we will learn a lot from her. Yeah, so thank you so much. If I missed anything, you can feel free to add, Dr. Danielle. So thank you. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Abdulrasheed. Thank you so much for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here talking about pluralism and history of economic thought. Anytime, I'm more than happy to talk about this. So yeah, let me thank the invite, the Department of Economics at Nile University, the Exploring Economics Network. It's a pleasure to be here, honestly. So, okay, I'm just gonna share my screen so you can all see my presentation. Abdulrasheed, please feel free to let me know if I'm running out of time, okay?
Sure, I will do that.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see.
Yeah, okay, fantastic. Okay, so based on the topic that I was proposed to present, so I'll give a brief talk with two main points. So the first part, I think it's more the standard talk about what is pluralism, where does it come from, why is this important, and how do we do it in practice. So it's that discussion of why pluralism is still an important topic to be discussed, and more importantly, how can we do this in practice, and why are the arguments to implement pluralism. And then I'm going to move and talk about the case of the history of economic thought. So pluralism applied. So my argument for today is that the history of economic thought is a truly pluralistic field. So we can see how these different approaches, different theories, different forms of knowledge, they coexist. And also how the history of economic thought can make us to better understand and implement pluralism, particularly in teaching, but also to rethink the way that we do research in economics. Then I'm going to finalize my talk by presenting how we can redo the history, the very own history of economic thought. So how can we transform, assuming that we're taking the case of pluralism as a benchmark, and this is something that we aim for the discipline of economics, how can we also change the discipline of the history of economic thought and make it more diverse and broad with different thinkers, different approaches, and different histories as well. So I brought this short video. I hope everybody will be able to see it if I play it. But the question is pluralism an impossible project? So this video was posted by the Rethinking Economics group, I think a few days ago. And it really tells us the essence, or at least the tensions that some people talk about when we refer to pluralism. I'll play it here. It's only a couple of seconds, but hopefully you'll be able to hear and see it. Sorry. So basically, is pluralism an impossible project? So I know that the audio might be a bit tricky, so I added the link here. You can also check this on the Rethinking Economics webpage if you want to see the video. But the question is pluralism an impossible project, right? My point is that actually pluralism is an important step when we think about making better economists. So can we successfully build something that I call the three-headed economist? So if we want an economist that is dynamic, if we want somebody that can understand the complexities of the real world, can bring different theories, different methods, understand better data, and can also reflect upon what they're doing and reflect upon their professional practice as economists and communicate information effectively, pluralism is the way to support this. So pluralism is an important step for us to think about economics as a better science, okay? Where does this come from? So I know there is a debate on how pluralism is important for a few years now, mainly after the global financial crisis, which has amplified some of the already existing calls from students and academics for a change of the state of economics. So if we look back, I would say 15 to 16 years ago, probably one of the first movements that came from students to demand different views in economics was from the post-autistic group in France. And this, after a few years with the global financial crisis, this amplified the discussion on how we can implement pluralism. Then the question is, okay, after 12 years has passed since 2008, what has changed? So we see a few changes in the discipline of economics, mainly on the side of new student movements. So we now have so many bodies from students that are aiming to push for this and to make economics a more realistic, a more comprehensive, better form of social science. So we have Rethinking Economics, we have the Post-Crash Society, the International Initiative for Pluralism, we have bodies within universities, we have academic networks. So INET, probably one of the most famous ones, Reteaching Economics, also the German network, providing new material for teaching. So mainly some of the work that the Exploring Economics Network is doing, the economy team in the UK, and some general interest that economics needs to change. So after 12 years, we see some change. So pluralism has indeed become become something that it's calling some attention. Has the discipline of economics changed? Well, then we can have that separate discussion probably during the questions and answers. But pluralism, this push for pluralism over the past 12 years has made some changes, at least in the sense of organizing economists and particularly the power of the student movements in that sense. So what is pluralism? So I think this is important for us to here to take a step back and think about what do we mean actually by pluralism in economics. I know a lot of people engage in the discussion, well, yeah, you have to have pluralism is important. Great, but I can see that a lot of people also don't understand what pluralism actually means and how we do this in practice. So a few years ago, I gave a similar talk on pluralism, and then I could see that after I was talking about for 20 minutes, somebody raised their hand and they're like, okay, but what is actually pluralism? What do you mean by this? So I was like, okay, let's take a step back. Let's look into the dictionary and see what actually pluralism means. So if we actually look into the definition of pluralism, we can see that it's the quality of the state or the state of being plural, relating to, consisting of, or containing more than one or more than one kind of class. So more than one definition or kind of class, so plural society, or holding the two or more positions at the same time. In the case of economics, here we mean a diversity of theoretical perspectives and accept that more than one view is correct, or more than one view needs to be accepted within the society of economists or within the academic discipline. However, and I hope that this was discussed on the previous talk, I guess, so I'll quickly go through that. However, what do we mean by pluralism in economics is multidimensional. So it doesn't mean necessarily just accept views, so it's not just about tolerance, but it also reflects on how we actually do economics. So it is an epistemological stance, so it's how we organize thinking. So the idea that more than one assumption or the view is important, so more than one theory, more than one approach. It is also an ontological stance, so it means that we don't only see reality in a certain way. So for instance, if we take neoclassical economics, we don't always see reality only on that sense, or the nature of reality can be made by different elements, by different things, and also the elements that are maybe hidden or it doesn't reflect in one theory or the other. So any causal structures, any struggles, any interests, what about collective action? So it's really to go beyond the idea that only one view is important. So pluralism against monism. And then finally, pluralism can also be referred to when we talk about different methodologies in economics. Here I mean on the sense on how we actually do economic analysis, how we do economics research, how do we examine the empirical world. Is there only one method that it's correct? Not really, but we know that when we think about research in economics, yes, there is only one method that most people would use. So pluralism can also be in the sense of different methodologies. So empirical, quantitative analysis, of course, but also, why not other methods? Qualitative, mixed method, narrative, historiographical methods, grounded theory. The world is open for so many different methods in economics. So pluralism can have these three dimensions, which I think it's quite important to pinpoint at this stage. Another point that I want to make is pluralism in economics, it's very different to say anything goes. Well, yeah, but if you're bringing pluralism, you want to talk about different approaches, different theories, but what are you going to include? This could mean anything. What about a rigorous science? Pluralism is not incompatible with a rigorous science. It actually makes science better, right? So here I bring the arguments from Sheila Dow. So she has an article on structured pluralism in economics. And she claims that pluralism allows us to have a different approach to economics, which is more open, which is more tolerant, which allows for the communication between different strands. But it's not just about acknowledging these differences, but we also need to create a space and a democratic space for these approaches to coexist. So here I claim that if we take other disciplines, for instance, where we see that there are different theories or different bodies of knowledge that sometimes clash, like if we think about mathematics or physics, I think they do a better job than what we do in economics, where you have a very dominant approach that really marginalizes the other approaches. So I think we need to consider how we can create this democratic space within the discipline that's much more tolerant and with a space for these approaches to coexist. And I like to make a parallel with this point with what we see in the history of economic thought. So history of economic thought is a truly pluralist field because you have different approaches that they coexist, but they are different in themselves. So you have different theories with different ontologies, so they see the world differently, they have different theories, different principles, but they coexist within the same structure. So it is a space where these approaches can actually coexist successfully. And this would give resistance to the mainstream critique of alternative approaches. So this is important to show that actually this can work. It's not about making economics less rigorous or just to say, well, yeah, anything goes. But actually is the opposite. We're making it more rigorous. We're broadening the type of knowledge that we are exploring. We're bringing different ways to see the world. It gives us different points of view. It gives us better policy solutions. It gives us a healthy debate into what we need as a science. So here I'll bring 4 arguments for pluralism in economics, which probably could be useful for our discussion afterwards. So like I said, pluralism is an ethical moral argument to the democratic and healthy evolution of a knowledge. So contrasting approaches, they need to coexist. So we cannot just take one approach and assume that that's the holy truth and move on. What about internal critiques, inconsistencies? Economics is not a linear science, so we need to have different approaches existing. And also economics is not a pure science, but it's actually a plural subject. So what we see as the benchmark in economics today, that's also a historical product from a certain time and place, from certain views, from certain power relations that existed within the discipline and outside of it. So the body of knowledge that we see in economics is also socially constructed. So this is something that I really like to pinpoint. When we look into the history of science as a whole, most bodies of knowledge, they are socially constructed. So this also applies for the case of economics. And in particular, we can see that economics has reproduced these hierarchies over the last, let's say, 60 to 70 years within certain power structures, within groups that hold certain views of the world. So it's not just about considering the mainstream or thinking about neoclassical economics as the dominant approach, but also we have to look into the sociology of the discipline. So who are the people, the groups, the actors, the institutions that still hold this particular view and dominate the way that we produce knowledge in the discipline? Also, another argument that I bring here is that schools of thought are different in their ontological assumptions, methods, and theories, but that doesn't mean better, more scientific, or closer to the truth. So it's not using neoclassical economics only, or it's not just about using institutional economics or post-Keynesian economics or Austrian economics because they are better, but it's about seeing the world differently. So again, I think the case of the history of economic thought applies. It's not about let's bring a menu and then we choose which one will be the winning approach. No, it's actually how can we see from these different approaches, how can they make us understand the world better? And of course, at some points, one approach may be wrong, one approach will have limitations and inconsistencies. But if we have a menu, this will give us a much better view of the world and how this will work. And then number 4, finally, acknowledging pluralism is not the same as encouraging or facilitating pluralism. So to say that pluralism is important, I'm pretty sure that if you ask 100 out of 100 economists, probably 95 of them will say, yeah, of course, pluralism is great. But to acknowledge that, it's very different to actually put this in practice, encourage, and make it as a formal agenda within the discipline. So this is why I really stress on how we need to create the space for this. It's not just to say, yeah, that's important, let's just move on and keep doing the same things that we're doing. We actually have to challenge and basically reconstruct the structures that we have in economics today. Also, let me point out a few caveats on pluralism. So thinking about how we implement, especially in the classroom, I think some people sometimes they claim that, oh, you don't want to be pluralistic when it comes to your research. I think pluralism in research and pluralism in teaching are two separate things. But I think that when we talk about pluralism in teaching, that is a foundational element. And that's why I like to stress that it's not just a tick box exercise. It's not just to say, well, yeah, we've added a couple of names here from the history of economic thought, or yeah, we add here on a footnote that sometimes endogenous money exists, let's just move on. So it's not just about minor examples, exceptions, or adding this on a footnote that nobody will read. We actually have to think about how we deliver a pluralistic agenda successfully. So it's actually to think what we do. And this is why I believe that it is a foundational point for us to think about economics education as a whole. And secondly, we cannot think about pluralism without thinking about diversity. So pluralism means diversity. Of course, theoretical diversity, intellectual diversity, and more. So implementing and achieving pluralism also requires for us to broaden our knowledge. So for us to go beyond the Western or Eurocentric view of what economics is, to go beyond the white male-dominate approaches that we have in economics. So pluralism is actually to bring everything else that we don't explore into the agenda. So to bring local perspectives that can actually be applied to regional realities and identities. So this also is part of the pluralistic agenda. And I really like to stress that pluralism and diversity, they walk hand in hand in this sense. Okay, so now let me quickly go through some of the points regarding pluralism and the history of economic thought. So how can we think about pluralism when applying this to the history of economic thought, and why the history of economic thought can make us better understand how pluralism can work in practice? So for those that don't know exactly how the history of economic thought actually works, I brought here a couple of points to create this introduction. So the history of economic thought is the field where all ideas and approaches in economics, they come together. So like I said, it is a truly pluralistic field. We have different schools of thoughts with different foundations, different backgrounds, different thinkers, but they try to understand reality. They try to understand similar economic and social phenomena from different starting points, which sometimes can be conflicting, but they coexist. So the historians of economics, we may have different views on how we understand economics sometimes, but we coexist. We try to look into how these ideas were created. We try to provide rational reconstructions or critiques to these views. However, the development of mainstream economics also shows its poor treatment towards its own history. So the history of economic thought has been sidelined over the last 30 to 40 years, particularly. So a science that concerns itself with understanding what exists rather than exploring its own achievements and failures. So with the rise of mainstream economics, or only a specific view of how the world should be and how economics should be done, this also has made the history of economic thought to be sidelined to some extent. So we see this in the development of economics as a discipline since especially the 1960s and 1970s. So the history of economic thought has been disappearing. It has been constantly under threat. We see it disappear in the curriculum. So it's not many courses in economics, many undergraduate degrees in economics that have a course on history of economic thought. Not many departments have historians of economics, so many of them, they disappeared. Others, they moved to other departments, so departments of history, social sciences, philosophy, etc. And this is problematic. Why? Because we cannot think about a healthy development of a science without actually understanding its history. So history of economic thought is a foundational element of how we do economics, but it has been under a crisis for quite a while. If we think about things like, okay, if you take a PhD in economics today, it's not in many countries or in many places that you actually can do a PhD in history of economics. So this really tells you something about the reproduction of the field within the discipline. So it has been completely sidelined in that sense, because it has been seen as something that is not important or is not rigorous, is not relevant to the development of new theories or new approaches or new models in economics. The point that I make here is that the history of economic thought makes us to understand pluralism better and also to implement pluralism better. So the history of economics is not linear, but with many shifts, accidents, and dominating approaches and theories. So the history of economics can really shows us how the discipline has evolved, how ideas came into place, and how the debates happen throughout time. But this is not linear. And this really clashes with, let's say, the standard approach to economics or the mainstream approach to economics, where this is linear. So we don't quite question that. The history of economics actually shows a very different story. And clearly, when we implement this in the teaching side, for instance, this doesn't come up in the classroom quite a lot, especially when we consider the core courses. So for those who teach micro, macro, or economic development, most of the times, if you take these courses from a standard approach, you don't question. You just assume that those principles, those theories, those models, or those views and representations of the world, they're just given. They are linear, they evolve quite smoothly and quite naturally, and then what? So this really doesn't reflect how our discipline is built. So this is why history of economic thought needs to be embedded in that practice. And also, most of the surviving history of economic courses that we see today, the ones that managed to survive and still exist, they still approach the topic as an uncontested linear truth made by white European males. So it's not just about implementing the history of economic thought into our discussions and into our degree, but also how we can improve the field of history of economic thought. So how can we make it more diverse and reflect different views of the world? So is the standard approach that we take of history of economic thought, is this the correct one? Especially when we're teaching economics outside the Western Anglo/US system. So is this the correct approach? So should we just take classical political economy, from Adam Smith to Keynes as the correct evolution of history of economic thought, the usual suspects, the giants or the founding fathers of economics? Or shouldn't we actually expand this further to make us understand how economics evolves? And again, I stress, particularly when we're teaching economics outside the UK or the US, where actually those theories came into place. So here I took this from the Exploring Economics website, and I think this really helps us to think about how we can rechart the history of thought and embed it in an economics course that shows how we can approach this from the comparing and contrasting point of view. So if we think about a problem-based approach, if we look into how actually we can implement this in practice, this is not new. So people like Sheila Dow has proposed this, the contrast and compare approach. Some of the books and some of the literature that are coming up more recently on how to teach pluralistic economics, they really emphasize this. So you compare different perspectives and how different schools and how different approaches they understand certain problems, and then you present them to students, how they understand it differently. Okay, so you go on a problem-based approach, and we can see that many of these problems, they overlap when we talk about different schools and different approaches in economics. So this could be quite a useful approach to use this in the classroom. Also, I bring this chart from the Miski's website, and it is quite small, so you cannot actually read it very clearly, I guess. But I added the link on the bottom here for the reference for those that want to take a look at this in more detail. So this is actually quite a long chart where you have historical events. So you go through the decades, what happened at that time. So the Industrial Revolution, World War II, gold standard, Bretton Woods, stagflation, etc. Then you have the schools of thought. So what do they understand as the main points? How do they see economic issues? How they see reality? And then you have the main thinkers. So I like to think about, for instance, the first line as a good introduction for micro, for instance, because we have the question of Industrial Revolution, we have the element of labor markets, we have equilibrium, we have rationality, we have the graph there, supply and demand and equilibrium. So this helps us to bring some background to students on where these ideas came up. You have Pareto optimality, you have general equilibrium from Valrasian approach. And then the three on the bottom, I like to use it when discussing macroeconomics. You have the views of Keynes, the opponents to Keynes. So then you would have Friedman, you would have Samuelson that tries to provide this synthesis between your classical economics and Keynesian economics. So when you teach ISLM, this is quite important. And you also have the contesting views. So the Cambridge, the Cambridge questioning of the capital. You have there's Rafa, John Robinson, and then more recently, the crisis of Keynesianism, the rise of new classical economics, Robert Lucas, rational expectations, etc. So this puts into perspective that the stuff that we teach in the classroom comes from the history of economics. So how can we put this into perspective for students that this is actually an evolution of different ideas? And it also has conflicting views, contrasting approaches. So it's not that linear, smooth process that sometimes people think it is. So it's quite actually an interesting evolution of ideas. Also, if we teach history of economic thought as part of the pluralistic curriculum, I also think it's also important to show the controversies. And I mean, not just with the chart that I was previously showing, but also how it conflicts within economics. So we have heterodox schools, we have the neoclassical approach, and the lineage. So who's influencing who is debating with who? I think this could also be quite useful. So I added all these resources. I'm happy to share them afterwards for people that are interested in this. More than happy to discuss this afterwards as well. Okay, but what this actually tells us about the history of economic thought. So how can we make better history of economic thought? So like I said, if we're thinking about pluralism, history of economic thought, it is an inherent part of the discussion. It makes us rethink the definition and the scope of economics and also its relationship to capitalism. So history of economic thought really puts into perspective what we do in economics. The definition of economics that we use today, if you take, for instance, the Robbins definition on the study and management of scarcity, this also is a historical product. So where does it came from, the implications of that, and also economics, if you look into the development of the discipline in the 50s and 60s, it has a very close relationship to the development of post-war capitalism and its debates with socialism. So really puts into perspective even what we do as a discipline. However, like I was saying a few minutes before, most of the surviving courses of history of economic thought today, they still approach the topic as an uncontested linear truth made by white European males. So this is where I'm going to present different ways for us to think the history of the discipline and how we could implement this. And here I mean not just in teaching, but how we can actually rethink the way that we do research in the history of economic thought. So if there are any scholars out there or PhD students who want to engage in the discipline, in the area of history of economics, this could give you a different approach to the subject as well. And more specifically, how many history of economic thought scholars, they still tend to focus on the history of the mainstream, which of course is important. We want to understand where did we get from and how do we get to this particular point. But also it's not the only history that we've got, especially if we're thinking about economics outside the UK or the US. So thinking about history of thought also means broadening up our knowledge to approaches that are still to be explored. And how can we do this in a better way? So if we think about how history of economic thought is usually taught, is this really what we're after? So if you go on Google, history of economic thought course, most of the times, these are the usual suspects that you're going to find. So it starts from the Greeks, Aristotle, Plato, somewhere within the Middle Ages. Then you go physiocrats, the classics, Adam Smith, Ricardo, Malthus, Marx. And then you move into the marginal revolution, Keynes. And then more recently, some people try to discuss Friedman, maybe Hayek or Robert Lucas, but that's it. And end of story. So is this really what we're after? Does this really reflect the whole field of knowledge that we have in economics, and especially outside the UK, the US? Not saying that this is not important. Of course it is, but there's much more to it. So here I'm going to bring 3 examples of topics that really make us to think how we can conceive the history of thought differently and reinterpret some of the things that we see in practice. So I'm going to give 3 examples of how perhaps we can do this in a different way. The first example is for us to reinterpret the founding fathers of economics. So usually we say to students, well, economics is a body of knowledge. Started as political economy in the 18th century with Adam Smith. So, but this comes from a Greek perspective, the oikonomia, why Aristotle, and then we explain the management of the household, management of the economy, etc. But why start with Aristotle and not other thinkers like Tatohab or Theravald that we have in Egypt or in India? So, and again, why Adam Smith and not Ibn Khaldun from Turkey? So the role of the Industrial Revolution and the British Empire in disseminating a specific view of economic ideas is still very dominant in how we think about the history of economic thought. So we actually need to change that perspective a little bit. And here's where history of economic thought and pluralism really feed onto each other. To reconsider, and I'm not saying to reject this perspective, I'm not saying that it's not important. It is important because it gives us a certain view of the world, but it's not the only view that we have. What about any recent founding mothers and fathers of economic thought in other countries? So I'm presenting here a workshop to the Nile University in Nigeria. What about founding fathers and mothers that bring economic ideas into the context of the Nigerian economy? Where are they? Who are they? How do they see this differently? Do they criticize the standard approach? Do they propose something different? How do they understand the context of the Nigerian economy? This is all yet to be explored and to be given a specific value on how we do this. Also, not just about the topic of what we're doing, but we can think about this also in the terms of methodological pluralism. So it's not just about the old rational reconstruction that we often see in the history of thought, but we can engage more in archival work. We can engage more in oral histories and try to build these histories that are still hidden in many countries and in many theories that are yet to be explored. The second example that I bring, so first to rethink the founding fathers of economics. The second point that I like to bring, and there is some research being done in this already, but always good to have more, which is to understand the role of gender in economics. So why do we take examples, approaches, always starting from a male perspective? The slide that I just shown you a few minutes ago on the history of economic thought is just men there. What about the other side? Women make more than 50% of the world population. Where is gender in economics? So here we can think about comparing and contrasting the conception of gender in neoclassical economics. So here we have the view of the household. We have Gary Becker's approach to the household and household economics, and the choices of labor division as being a rational choice, and the contrast of those principles with the heterodox approaches to gender. So here we think about feminist economics, institutional economics, Marxist economics. So they say something different about how gender plays an important role in economics, coming up from the structures, coming up from class struggles, coming up from the social construction of the woman coming up from the woman as a social construction, and how that impacts the economy and impacts power relations. So bringing all of those into economics. And also about the ideas that are behind this. So ideas about why only paid work and why only market-based activities, they have become the benchmark in economics. So why do we ignore or we don't analyze unpaid work, care work? Why do we still take a very narrow approach to gender gaps and not just pay gaps, but the other gaps that we see, the different dimensions of inequality, gender discrimination in the economy? So how can we analyze all of these, and how the history of ideas in economics can help us to understand these issues much better? And then the third example is to rethink economic development from a global south perspective. So again, how does the history of economic thought can help us to bring that? Well, first, by bringing different perspectives. So we have, for instance, dependency theory in Latin America, how they think economic development not as a transition or as a phase, but as under development, as something in that it's basically the definition of what we see in Latin American economies. Also, how we can think about post-colonial development and the post-colonial economic thought that came up as part of that. There are substantial bodies of knowledge, especially in Indian, South African, Ethiopian, and Egyptian economic thought on post-colonialism and how that impacts the economy in terms of planning, in terms of societal divisions, in terms of economic activities, in terms of acknowledging paid and unpaid work, market-based activities and non-market-based activities. So what do we actually understand as economic growth and development comes from a specific view of the issue. But what about all the other approaches? So growth and development, or what we understand as economic growth and economic development, these are also historical products of a specific time and place within the history of economics, especially in the 1940s, 1950s post-war economics. So why do we take, for instance, GDP as a good measure of growth and to some extent development, rather than things like well-being and happiness? So history of economic thought can provide us an alternative for that. And history of different economists, ideas, methodologies for measurement, all of that can be thought if we diversify and bring a pluralistic perspective to the very history of economic thought. So why not look more like this rather than the other slide that I was showing you? Why not bring different perspectives from different times, different places, much more diverse in terms of origins, in terms of gender, in terms of ethnicity, So my side of the story, at least, or my view, is that we can make better history of economic thought if we actually embed the meaningful points of what pluralism means. History of economic thought is a truly pluralistic field, so then we need to make it as such, okay? So I'll stop here. I know I'm running out of time already. So thank you very much. And yeah, I'm happy to take questions at any time.
Wow, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Danielle. That is really wonderful presentation, and I'm sure most of the participants will agree with me that you've done us like really justice in relation to this topic. And so we have a lot of quite a couple of questions, and I'll try to run them fast. We have 10 minutes to finish the session.
Should I keep my screen shared, or?
Yes, if there's a question that requires you to go back to the page, I think you can do. Yeah. So the first one I would like to call is from Zanna, who asked, pluralism in economics being a process of accommodating different views in theoretical and methodological mainstream. Does this hold after hypothetical tests, or is it built on thought and assumptions?
To implement pluralism?
I think so. It's not very clear, but I think maybe.
If I understood correctly, no. I mean, this is it's not just based on assumptions. No, it is a, let's say, a well discussed and well thought approach to the discipline.
Okay.
I think if I understood correctly about how pluralism came into place. Yeah.
So the next one asks, since pluralism refers to diversity of theoretical perspectives or method, what theoretical perspective suit today's economy and the way forward to achieving a greater economy?
Well, that's a good question. I think that there is no single view that provides the best solution for everything. And I think this is why pluralism is important, because it's like we had a menu of options, a menu of different forms of seeing the world. And this reflects how different economists understand the world. But my view is that not necessarily there is one approach that has all the best answers for everything at any time. So I think if we have more diversity of ideas, if we have more pluralism in that sense, it gives us the better tools to pick and to cherry pick and to actually pinpoint things that are more useful to understand certain problems. So that would be my view. So for instance, if we want to understand the impacts of COVID on the world today, from, I don't know, impacts on economic growth, impacts on employment, impacts on households, I don't think that there is one approach that will give us the answer to everything. But having more approaches will help us to pick up on how we can understand that better, and also to provide better solutions. So that's why I think pluralism offers this breadth and this richness of knowledge.
Okay, that is great. So here we have a question from Timu, and it's written, you wrote in your slide that history of economic thought is about trying to understand economic and social phenomena. But then you said it is about understanding how economic ideas developed. To me, only the latter sounds like history of science. The former sounds like economics or social science. Can you explain the quote?
Okay. So the history of economic thought is to understand the evolution of economic ideas or economic phenomena or economists, so the history of economists, and how they understand social and economic phenomena. So the history of thought can give us an idea of how the theories or how economists, they understood certain things in a time and place. So it is, to some extent, like we see in the history of science. History of economic thought is also, to some extent, an interdisciplinary body of knowledge, because it picks up things from the history of science, from the history of philosophy, history of political science. So yeah, it is a quite diverse field of knowledge in that sense.
Okay. The next one asks, why is the study of history of economic thought considered to be important, and that economic ideas, after all, are the result of objective social and economic reality? I don't know if you get the question clearly.
Yeah, no, I think I got it. I think, so why is it important? So the way that we usually study economics, or the way that most economists, they approach the subject or they do research in economics, understands economics as a very linear form of knowledge, uncontested, as the ultimate truth, without any questioning, very neutral, very aiming to be scientific. So the history of economic thought actually puts that all into perspective. The way that we understand economics today, it is as it is because that's a historical product. So it was a product of a certain time and a certain place, and that became the benchmark, and that became the norm. The history of thought, the history of economics, shows us how this happened.
Okay, great. We have another one from Patricia, and she asks, how do we balance the materials introduced to students when teaching economics subjects? Is it advisable to parallel reading materials, that is mainstream versus heterodox, or will it become too much to take in a semester's time? I think this is a question that always comes up. So how do we...
No, I agree. I agree. That's probably the biggest challenge for us to think about teaching pluralism. So my view is that not necessarily we need to reduce, I mean, some people, they say, well, if you're presenting pluralism and if you're presenting contexts in a historical perspective, that would just take up the time that you could be doing something more technical or something that students will value more in terms of employability skills and etc. But not necessarily, because you can put that into perspective. So for instance, I'm like, if you're teaching macroeconomics, principles of macroeconomics, you're still going to present everything that you're going to present, but you can put that all into perspective. And students, they can have a better sense of how those models, they came into place, how different economists understand the economy at the time. And it will also give them the realization that that's not the ultimate truth. So the models that you guys are seeing, it's not the ultimate solution for everything, but it's representations of the world that can help us to understand better the world and to make more sensible decisions. So we can always put that into perspective. It's not like you have to not teach, I don't know, ISLM in economics and teach history of thought instead. No, you can do both.
Okay, great. So there is Pavel, I think, who is your colleague at the University of Bristol. I saw he just, he was asking a question and, or comment, and I don't know if he can switch on audio and talk. He's also a very heterodox economist, and I've seen some of his works, and I really admire it. So maybe before he starts talking, let me go to the next question. This one is asking, where or how did we get it wrong in terms of deviating from inherent pluralism in history of economic thought, and how can we revert back?
That's a great question. This is a historical product. That's my view of it. So that's how economics became science, especially in the 20th century, of course, but especially over the last 70 years. Economics, especially in the post-war, became this professionalized body of knowledge. You see economists working in government institutions, advising, creating models to forecast, and that, let's put to some perspective, narrowed down the way that the economics discipline has evolved. So if we are pursuing something like that, so if we have a view of what the economist is, this was pursued through time, and by making that more scientific, or by making economists the professionals that we have in mind today, you know, the white male in a suit with a briefcase and etc. For that to happen, you need to scrap down and reduce all the other subdisciplines and other forms of knowledge that exist in economics. There is a lot of debate how actually that came into place. So is it a demand from the public that we want economists to be like that, and we want economists to be, I don't know, good forecasters? Or is this something that came from the discipline in itself? I think it's a combination of both.
Okay, that is great. So we have a question from Dell, and they're asking, what is your take that plurality in the methodological aspect affects the quality of research in economics?
I think pluralism can make a better science in economics, better research and better teaching. Research, I mean, I don't say that we all have to do pluralistic research. It's not like you have to embed different things in the research that you do. I'm not saying that you necessarily have to change your research agenda. But what I'm saying is we need to give more space to other methodologies, specifically methodologies and other approaches that do not necessarily fall into the standard that we assume economics to have. So not necessarily quantitative research, not necessarily modeling, not necessarily forecasting.
Okay, great. And so this one, I'm just trying to select from the questions because we're running out of time. So let me just read the comment by Dr. Pavel. And he said, great talk, Danielle. Can you talk a bit more about how the sociology of the economic profession impacts the openness of economists to pluralism? Specifically, what if I'm a student with interest in biology and geography, but I'm not particularly excellent in math? Will I be able to get into a good economics program? How can we think of the entry requirements to the profession that we require from our students as being shaped and influenced by gatekeepers in the profession? And who these gatekeepers actually are? Will the discipline become less rigorous if we lower our requirement in formal skills? Requirements on formal skills. So I think requirements for mathematics or algebra.
I see economics as a very broad social science. I think you can have mathematical economists, you can have non-mathematical economists, so you can have historians of economics, you can have sociologists of economics, you can have development economists. I think it is a science that it's broad enough. But the problem is, and that's probably one of my biggest concerns, the way that economics narrows down, and especially this goes, of course, in research, but also in teaching, is that the gatekeepers, putting broadly, powerful departments, the intellectual elites, editorial boards of top journals, they reproduce a form of view of economics that it's very narrow. And that will reflect on how knowledge is created, that will reflect on the view of the economist by the public. So I mean, Pavel probably knows my view about this, but I would say that economics is broad enough to accomplish for all those areas. But it becomes a problem, for instance, when when you have to take a PhD in economics. For you to gain a PhD in economics, you have to only do modeling, for instance. I think that's problematic. That doesn't make economics more rigorous. It makes it actually much more narrow and with a very specific view of the world that doesn't really help us to understand reality.
Yes, exactly. But unfortunately, I think maybe it has some historical roots, I think, from the emergence of neoclassical economics last century and all that. And maybe also this hierarchy of knowledge where if you don't do modeling or if you don't write smart or run some regression, you're not seen as a smart economist. Yeah,
exactly.
a sociologist or a political scientist.
Exactly.
I think that's, yeah, I think it's from our own arrogance to look like physicists. I think there's something like that, which is unfortunate. So
what we do as economists is understand the world. It's try to understand reality, it's trying to understand economic and social activity and social provisioning processes. Is not just to crunch numbers. Crunch numbers is one way to understand the world. It's not the only one.
Yeah. So let me get the last question and I think we can go. So maybe let me just take this one. Going by the pluralism of economics thought, wouldn't it create more intellectual confusion in the world of economics? And maybe let me add with another one. Do you see a future of economics free from any form of mathematics?
Sorry, can you repeat the last one?
Is there any way where economics as a discipline could be free from mathematical things?
Okay, so for the first one, I don't think it can cause confusion. It can cause some, I don't want to say, I don't think confusion is the right word. I mean, it can cause some debate. I think debate, and not necessarily you will get to the right answer or to one correct answer every time. So it can cause maybe some uncertainty, probably yes, but I don't think it will cause confusion, because with confusion is you have to make it clear when we talk to pluralism, for instance, to students, is to say that, look, these are different views to understand the problem. They are conflicting, they clash between each other, yes, but that doesn't make it a problem on itself, right? And then if economics can be free from any mathematical form, I would say the answer to that is actually, it depends. I think what I would like to see is something completely different from what I think it will happen in the future. I don't think economics can be 100% free of mathematics. But if we look back, and then I like to bring history again, if we look back into what the classics did, for instance, into what Smith or Ricardo or even Marx did it, they used mathematics in a very different way from what you use today. So I'm very skeptical to the use of mathematical modeling, because I don't think that is useful for everything. If I think that that will disappear, I don't think anytime soon, but probably will in the future. Economics has changed so many times. And one thing that we know, at least from being a historian of economics, is that nothing will dominate forever. So probably it will change at some point, but I just don't know for now. I don't think so.
Okay, that is great. And I think this brings us to the end of the session. Thank you, Dr. Danielle, for this wonderful presentation and for accepting to speak here. And thank you, everyone, for attending. And we just briefly spoke about decolonization. And if you see, I just dropped something in the chat from the Pavel, who is also from University of Bristol. And fortunately, we have a session today on decolonizing economics perspective from young African economists. We have 3 speakers from this session, 2 from South
Great
Africa,
session, by the way.
yeah, and 1 from Nigeria. So please, if you'll be able to attend, I think we'll be able to have some debates, how to broaden economics, but most especially how to make it more relevant to Africa, recognize the importance of race, colonial history, and development as a whole. So I really look forward to that. But at 1:30, we will have the 3rd session, which will be given by Dr. Mohammed Kabir from Ahmad Bello University in Nigeria. So please, if you'll be able to attend, that would be fantastic. So thank you everyone for joining, and thank you to Dr. Danielle once again. Yeah, and see you.
No, thank you. Thank you, Abdulrasheed, for the invite once again. I see some people asked for the references for the charts and everything. I can share a PDF version of my presentation with you, and then you can circulate.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
So
Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.